Hello, good day, and welcome to this free facilitation webinar, Nimble, off script but still on track. My name is Martin Gilbraith. I'm delighted to welcome you all today, and particularly to Rebecca Sutherns, author of the book, Nimble. I'll invite you to introduce yourselves in just a second, Rebecca, and also Sunny Walker, who's partnered with me on many of these webinars. Just before I invite both of you to introduce yourselves, I want to invite all of those who've joined the webinar to use the chat pod on the right to share introductions as well and to introduce yourselves, and also, of course, the poll pods in the middle to give us an impression of who's here, what experience you bring, and also any interests or expectations you have for the webinar. In particular, any facilitation scenario that has surprised you in your experience or that has concerned you as a potential surprise. And we can ask Rebecca to respond particularly to those when she comes to present in a few minutes. So just before we do any of that, just an overview of this series of facilitation webinars for anybody who's not attended before. The aim of the series is to give all of you an opportunity to learn about facilitation and ICA's technology of participation approach in particular, although not so much in particular this time, in a free 1-hour interactive online session that provides some valuable content, but also gives you an experience of virtual facilitation as well, and some of the potential of Adobe Connect. The session will be recorded, so please don't share anything in the chat pods that you would not like to be publicly available afterwards. The recording will be shared, and so will the slides and a transcript of the chat pods after the meeting. They'll be posted on my website by tomorrow. The inspiration for this particular session clearly is Rebecca's book, which has just been published a month or so ago. I have my copy here. I hope some of you have yours already. I met Rebecca attending the IF North America conference in Ottawa last year. And she was leading a session on improv in facilitation, which I enjoyed very much, found very insightful, and so was delighted when she invited me to review a manuscript of the book and to offer an endorsement on the back of it. So having read that and been delighted by what I read, I thought it would make a great topic for a webinar. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining me. Would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, Martin. Really nice to be here and great to see so many people here from all over the world. I'm excited by that. I'm based in a place called Guelph, Ontario. It's about an hour west of Toronto. And I've been working in facilitation for about 23 years. I do mostly strategic planning and stakeholder engagement, governance work with community sector leaders. And yeah, I'm just very excited to be able to share some of that with you today and just give you a taste of some of the pieces of Nimble facilitation that I've been playing with lately.
Thank you, Rebecca. And Sunny, we don't have a moving image of you today because your webcam's not working, but we know you're there. Would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm here in quite snow-covered Denver for the moment with a facilitation and training practice myself, bordering on a retirement option in the next 2 or 3 years. So looking at what does it look like to go mostly virtual and not be schlepping tables.
Thank you. Well, great to have you with us again. As I say, please do all introduce yourselves in the chat pod. Use the one in the middle to share any particular interests you have for this session. I'm just going to mention there's 20 of us already so far, plus the 3 hosts you see at the top of the screen. So great to have such a good turnout. There were actually 79 registered, so we may have some more coming, but it's very common in these free facilitation webinars that everybody doesn't show up. I see from your responses on registration that we have a very wide diversity of people who at least registered for this, including people who use top facilitation, Lego serious play, innovation workshops, people who work particularly with conflict, with NGOs, with hospitals, with adults and youth, C-suites, all sorts. And some of the interests that I read for the webinar, people talking about how to handle angry outlier, how to respond in the moment, gain tools to make the most of interactions when people have to go off script, how to be better prepared to go off track. Several people also saying that they're interested in virtual facilitation and learning from the process and technology of this session, as well as the content of it. How to manage rogue thinking, I like that phrase. How to be a little less invasive and more free. How to avoid facilitation pitfalls and be more adaptive. Flexibility and adaptability, lots of that. Anything that you noticed, Rebecca, in the registrations or in the introductions just now?
I was really interested in the range of experience we have in the room, and I'm delighted by that, because part of my interest in writing the book was to make sure that we're addressing the needs of people who are really experienced facilitators as well as new ones. Because my sense is that there's quite a bit out there for early facilitator people, but not as much for people that have been doing this for a while. So my hope is to fill up the toolbox and mindset of folks that have been around the block a few times with this stuff, as well as for people that are new. So I was happy about that.
Thank you. One of the things that appealed to me about the book, and that I really appreciated about the book, was your premise that there is, at least relatively speaking, and absolutely speaking, there's a lot of training and resource and support available on tools, and a lot of people know about tools and like tools and are anxious to get more tools. Relatively speaking, there's quite a lot on how to design a process to apply tools, but there's actually very little on how to manage when your great tools and best design just don't go as you expected, and you have to improvise. And that really is the test of a great facilitator versus a good one, I think, or a novice. So I think the book and this topic really does fill a gap. So thank you for that. Interests and expectations. We see undercurrent of factions bubbling into loud disagreement from Susan, and from Christiane, managing different opinions, contradictions in a smooth and agile manner. Passive aggressiveness from Sunny. And Sarah, angry outliers and rogue thinkers, best describes some of Therese's surprising scenarios. I was surprised very recently when I got the participants list for a session I was leading, and it included 2 interpreters. After I had discussed with the client, would everybody be able to speak English? This was in a country where English is not widely spoken, but I'd understood that it would be all in English, and then I got there, it turned out it was not going to be in English. It was all going to be in the local language. So that was interesting. We got there in the end. Anything else you notice in the introductions or the expectations? Guest was surprised that the space was the same as their workplace. I've often been anxious in advance of a meeting as to whether I'd find somewhere to put a sticky wall or just any wall space where I can attach things to the wall. Yeah. That's quite often been a surprise for me. Or I find that the walls are peeling plaster or they're exposed brick and there's nothing you can use to attach anything to it. So there's some things for you to go on, Rebecca, I think. Are you ready to go on to our presentation? Yeah, excellent. Thank you all. So I didn't mention, but you can see on the left there underneath the logo, following these introductions, we're going to go into a short presentation from Rebecca, 15-20 minutes maybe, with some Q&A after that. So during the presentation, please feel free to use the chat pod to type any questions or reflections, and we'll put some of those questions to Rebecca after the presentation. And then after that, we'll be making sure we have some time to put some questions to you and to invite you to speak, those that have microphones, and share something of your experience of difficulties and surprises and how you have responded and what you've learned along the way. So that's the discussion section, item 3 on the agenda. And we're aiming to try and finish at least 3 or 4 minutes before the top of the hour for a short reflection before we close. So that's the agenda. Let's move on to our next layout then, and we'll invite Rebecca to talk us through some of what she has prepared.
Great. Thanks, Martin. What I wanted to do today really was to model Nimble facilitation by sort of responding really to those scenarios that you have suggested earlier. So you'll see me flipping a little bit through slides because I wanted to wait and see which ones were most relevant to you. So I've got a few sort of general comments at the beginning, and then we're going to work through some scenarios that'll just give you a flavor of some of the ways that I think about this, because what Martin said is very true, and that is that I'd like to really normalize the idea that things don't go as planned. I think they almost always don't go as planned. And in fact, when they go as planned, I'm suspicious because it makes me think that someone somewhere is holding on too tightly to their precious plan and not letting people be human in the room. So I'm actually not scared of things going off script. I want them to, but a little bit on language. Off script, I'm fine with. Off track, less so. And so we're figuring out how to be okay with not following our script, but figuring out at the same time what it means to stay on track. And so as I think about that, really the details of inside the small language of the table here aren't as important as the headings. What I want to kind of propose to you is that if we think about this in a chronological way across this table, what happens in advance really matters in terms of Nimble facilitation. And then what happens in the room is probably what most of us are thinking about when things kind of go south or are threatening to. And that requires agility in the moment, whereas prior to that, you need really good skills in anticipation. But I also want to highlight that after the fact, there's still some stuff you can do to really absorb what happened, learn from it, reflect enough on it that it can inform your practice going forward, and maybe even salvage things if things really did go in an unhelpful direction in the session. So that's how my thinking was organized. But and I look at it in terms of often in terms of those 4 P words down the side as kind of a quick way of thinking about it. And we'll talk about those 4, but there's certainly obviously more detail on that in the book itself. But really what I wanted to talk about is the fact that I think the planning phase represents roughly 3/4 of the work you need to do. And yet the in the room phase, the 20%, represents probably 90% of our stress, right? That's what we're most scared of, is what's going to actually happen in the room. And my contention is that the more homework you do in advance, the better things are going to go in the room. That seems intuitive. I guess what I would say is things are going to go off script. Don't let them go badly off script because of things you could have prevented. There's lots of reasons why they will go south for reasons that have nothing to do with you, and there's only so much we can do about that. But you don't want to be the cause of that derailment if you can help it. And so that's really what I spend a lot of my time thinking about, is how to prepare well. And also, in a sense, to share my 20 years of hindsight with people that don't have that, so that you don't have to have that sick feeling in your stomach of going way off track in order to get this a little bit under control. So what I would encourage you to do is have a look at this little diagram here. We know that we tend toward one side of this balance or the other, just naturally in our temperament. So if you are someone who likes to wing it and improvise, and when you saw this title, you went, Nimble, that's me because I just wait and see what happens, you would be on the left-hand side of that balance. Whereas if you tend to be a highly scripted, detail-oriented person, you're probably going to be on the right-hand side of that. And my point is that people who are highly orchestrated at the bottom of the right-hand side are really heavily scripted. Whereas on the left, highly improvisational people tend to be very spontaneous. My suggestion is that if we can find a happy medium, that really great facilitation is almost invisible. It's hardly seen. And I hope that each of us has had that experience, if not from the front of the room, then maybe as a participant, where you go, wow, we just walked through this thing that was amazingly fun and productive, and we hardly noticed it happened. And so if you are coming from the right-hand side of that balance and you need to move toward the middle, I'm going to encourage you to let go of your script and cling to it a little less tightly. And if you are coming from the winging it side, you might want to have a script, So we're going to talk about what it looks like to find our way to the middle. And I'd encourage you to locate yourself where you are now and kind of which direction, east or west, you need to find your way to that middle area. So I've got a bunch of possibilities, and I'm going to start with this one because Martin mentioned what happens, and this will be very quick because we already have this experience. We've mentioned it. What happens if your venue is terrible? So this is part of planning, and I want to encourage you that space is a planning variable. Don't just take it as given, because it can make or break the success of your session. And so if you don't have a systematic way of double checking the quality of your venue, it risks undermining your ability to run a good session. And those of us that have had that situation where the walls are falling off plaster understand that. And I have to say that I mess up in this area all the time. I can't believe that this still happens to me, that I don't ask the right questions. So for example, if I say to a client or an organizer, does the room have smooth, empty wall space? What they hear is, does the room have walls? So they always answer yes. They always say, yes, it does. And then you arrive and the room looks like something like in this picture and you go, okay, there's a bunk bed and a screen and a TV and art and bumpy bricks and whatever else. So make sure that you're asking lots of questions. I mentioned it there on the slide. Have a really good checklist. My website, sage-solutions.org, has a space planning checklist in the resource section for free if you want it. Treat space as a creative planning variable. You can do some very cool things. One example I use often is I was doing a workshop on local food planning, and we held that workshop at a local farm and had lunch with produce grown at the farm and went on a tour of the farm. Well, I can assure you that local food planning was much more intriguing to the participants than it would have been had we had that same conversation in a boring boardroom somewhere. So your space is actually a resource for you to use. And so as a facilitator in your planning, make sure it's really great, because it can accelerate what happens in your room, but it can also really undermine you if you don't have the right environment or vibe. So that's one little tip on venue as planning variable. I'd like to jump ahead to one that that I think is another really common one, and that is, I'm still learning sort of how to jump ahead on this, I'm afraid. What I want to do is I'm sorry that I'm doing this because I don't know how to jump ahead. I want to talk about time. This is another planning issue. When I plan a one-day session, which actually frankly isn't as often as it used to be because people have less and less time and they want me to help them do a whole strategic plan in an hour and a half, but if they're willing for me to do a whole day, my shorthand version of that is that I think of a whole day session in chunks, and I think of it in 4 90-minute chunks. And so if a whole day planning task seems daunting to you, 4 90 minutes might not be as much of a big deal. And then I also think of those 90 minutes in 30-minute chunks. So you can see a little bit on the right-hand side of this slide. This is a simplified version of the facilitation template that I use. Because if you can divide up your time, it won't get away from you quite as much because you're checking in every 30 minutes or every 90 minutes, and you're not likely to have things kind of get away from you the way you would if you kind of planned the whole day in one chunk. So that's another little planning tip for staying on top of things. Another related one for which I use a very similar template is if you are kind of lost, right? Have you ever had that feeling? Now we're jumping head into the room, but you go, I thought I knew where we were, and man, if the facilitator doesn't know where we are, the group doesn't have a hope. So you've got that panicky feeling. But I use this same template for that, but I add a layer to it, and you can see it there on the right-hand side of that slide. Every chunk has a purpose. And so it's really important in your day, if we're using our one-day example, that you know obviously what the why is, or the outcome or the deliverable for that day. But I would really encourage you to break it down into those chunks and understand the why of each chunk, partly for your own benefit. It's like those blazes on a trail when you're hiking, where the theory is if you see one of those colorful things tied to a tree, the idea is when you stand at one tree, you should be able to see the blaze at the next tree. It's how you stay on track. And so if you've planned out your day so that each chunk has a purpose, if one of your chunks doesn't go well, you're not messed up for the whole day. You don't go, oh, now the whole rest of the day was dependent on that one thing. You go, okay, this one 30-minute thing or this one 90-minute thing didn't go quite the way we thought, but you can find your way back. And so really the bigger picture point here is make sure that your planning tools serve you well. And so if you are someone who's highly orchestrated, you need a very detailed agenda. We were mentioning earlier how fabulous Martin is at planning webinars, and he sent us this lovely planned script. And I love working with people like that because I'm so not. that I need people like that in my life. And he is great at highly detailed, very organized agendas. If that is you, do that, because it will keep you relaxed. And it's really important that whatever your system is, that you do what you need to do to stay at your best and stay relaxed. What you don't want to do, though, is impose that same level of detail into your session in a way that sort of handcuffs you or makes you feel really, really married to an agenda. How many of you have been to a meeting, for example, where the agenda is, at 10:12 a.m. we will do this, and at 11:14 we will do this. And if we get to the place where it said 10:12 and now it's 10:15, the real planners in the room are starting to hyperventilate, right? They're like, you told me 10:12 and it's 10:15. Whereas, if you'd been told we're doing these 3 things this morning, and you wouldn't stress over the fact that it was, a little off where we thought. So if you are someone that needs this kind of level of detail, absolutely do it, and then figure out how to loosen your grip on it. Because I just want to jump ahead to something here that is about the difference between an agenda. I'm getting back to this one, I promise. I'm getting back to this one because you might say, oh, I've got an agenda, it's fine. You're not the detailed person. You're like, I got this rough thing. I would really encourage you to have a very detailed facilitation plan for you, but that's not the same thing as the agenda that the participants need to see. So what participants can see, really, I'm a big fan of, they have to know when to show up, when to leave, when we'll eat, and what the purpose is. If they had homework to do, that helps, but I don't usually have that. So, it's really about what's this for and when do I have to be there and where. But for me, I break it down into much more detailed work around what are we trying to accomplish, the purpose, the content, what's the topic, and most agendas only have that. But then be looking at what are we going to do activity-wise to get there, what do I need to bring, and how long is that going to take. So what you have facing you is very different than what they have facing them. And that's a really helpful way to kind of work through some of this. I'd like to move on to a couple of other scenarios that you might find are frustrating for you or derailing for you. And some of you mentioned this ahead of time in terms of participants that are either passive aggressive or downright openly aggressive in a session. And I'm going to do that with an image that might be a little bit surprising to you. Here it is. Sorry, there it is. So Chris Hadfield is a Canadian astronaut. And for those of you interested, he's got a great TED Talk. It's called something about going blind in space, how the day I went blind in space, I think it's called. And I love his talk for 2 reasons. One is that he talks about the difference between being scared of something, fearful, and actually being in danger of it. And he talks about black widow spiders, because in Canada, where I live, black widows are the only poisonous spider that we have. And they only live in one province of the country on the West Coast. So if you're not from British Columbia, your likelihood of running into a poisonous spider is virtually 0 in Canada. However, if you ask Canadians if they are afraid of spiders, many of them would say yes, more than 0, more than just 1% or whatever. His point is that we are scared of things more than the actual risk of those things happening. So in my experience training facilitators, when you ask people what they are most scared of, it's some variation of the disruptive participant, the belligerent participant, the non-compliant participant, something like that. So the first thing I would say is that the fear of that is very real and very common. The danger of it is lower than you think. At least in my culture, people are pretty polite and compliant, and they don't disrupt that much. But the passive aggressive thing is probably pretty real. So don't be overly scared of something that isn't necessarily a danger. However, what I would also say is that I believe that good process is preventative. So if you run a really solid meeting where you are doing, like where you've got the basics in place, you're using people's own words, you're running a very structured, purposeful process, you are democratizing things so that power dynamics in the room are in fact mitigated by the processes you choose. And I can talk more about that if you want to. All of those things will contribute to people having less of a need to be disruptive if the agenda has been set with their needs in mind and they've had some voice in terms of what's going on in the room. All that kind of stuff is really preventative of disruptive behavior. If you are then seeing disruptive behavior, and I see your question around between participants, not just with the facilitator, I would offer just a couple of tips, and that we could talk about this for many webinars, so I realize I'm not doing it justice here. I've said on the slide to intervene small and early, and what I mean by that is if you are seeing things brewing, you're better to intervene in a very low-key way when things are starting to go off track in low-key ways. If you wait till things are loud, you're going to have to be loud in some equivalent way, and that's not helpful. So you want to keep your intervention aligned with what's going on in the room, and you want to keep it early. And sometimes that can be something as small as somebody's been consistently on their phone and you've asked them not to be, and it's really distracting to other people, or you sense that it is. You're not going to single them out probably in front of the whole room and say, could you put your phone away? You know, pull out your mom voice or something. But I might physically go and stand closer to them. I'm not saying anything different. I'm still talking to the room, but it's a little awkward to be on your phone when the facilitator is standing right at your shoulder compared to when they're across the room from you. Little awkward, not as bad as being singled out. So we could chat about more of that in the chat, in the questions. The other thing that I do find is that two things. One is that I keep people active and moving a lot. So they don't actually have time to kind of get into it with one another all that often because they've got a job to do and it moves fast. And so if you keep the energy up, people are unlikely to get as stuck. And also, if I'm really not sure if a particular disagreement or point of contention in the room is worthy of the whole group's attention or not, I will ask the group. And I will say, you know, I can hear this happening. I can see this happening. Is this something that the whole group wants to deal with right now or not? Or I might frame it another way. I hear this. It seems a little off track to me, but I'm not positive. Would you be willing for us to spend 5 more minutes on this? Or would you be willing for that little conversation the two of you are having at your table to become a conversation for the whole group? Often they look awkward and go, no, this isn't for everybody. I'm like, great. If it's not for everybody, we need to not have it right now, or can I ask you to go out and have it somewhere else if it absolutely has to happen right now? So what I love about all of that is, I guess I'm on a bit of a crusade not to be the oblivious facilitator. The oblivious facilitator is the person who just carries on, right? Carries on with her script, carries on with her plan, whatever his intention was, he's doing it, regardless of what's going on in the room. And what I'm really a fan of is responsive facilitation. Pay attention to what's happening in the room and be not only aware of it, but candid with the group about it, and putting responsibility back to them to say, how do we together want to handle this dynamic? So that it ceases to be about me and them all the time one-to-one, but it also reminds people that they're part of a group in that day, and it's not really appropriate to have a one-to-one battle in that moment either. So just a little bit on disruptive participation, disruptive participants. I would like to do 2 more scenarios and then I'll stop. And I'm going to flip through here. I know there's a better way for me to do this. I'm so sorry, but aha, here it is. This is the one I wanted. Here's your scenario. I am so tired. I am so busy. I am, you know, I've got a new baby. I'm jet lagged. I've got a cold. I'm whatever, right? My big thing in Nimble facilitation, and perhaps I should have started with this, is that you are your best asset. People are hiring you. And so if you are not at your best, the likelihood of you being able to adjust well is lower. We know what that's like. When we are hungry, when we are tired, when we are ticked off or whatever, our ability to flex drops dramatically because our brain goes into that fight or flight stressed out mode. When I am stressed, I can't learn. When I'm stressed, I can't listen. When I'm stressed, I can't adjust. And so what I'm suggesting is that you literally treat yourself like an Olympic athlete. You are in training. You need to be your best self. And your state in the room is way more important than your script. And so my number one thing when people, I do facilitation coaching, and when people say to me, what's the best thing I should be doing the night before the big thing? My number one answer is go to bed early. Because you at your best is your strongest tool in your toolbox, and I think we know this. I mean, you're probably all going, yeah, you know, no big deal. We don't do it well. We know lots of things, but we really don't do it well. And I just know that my ability to respond creatively to what's happening in the room goes up enormously when I'm in good space. So I would just really encourage you to be disciplined about that. If we can't be very disciplined all the time, we've got a limited amount of willpower, right? Spend it wisely and use it the night before your big session. One last quick one for you. I've got others, but we'll keep it with this. I want you to question the voice in your head. My friend Nancy calls this your headator. I want, when you're going, oh, that was terrible, it was so awful, you know, I needed to be more nimble, I needed to be this, I needed to be that. This is the afterward piece, or one of the afterward pieces, and we can talk about others if you want to. But I would say that one of the things I would really pay attention to on this is to go, did it bomb? How do you know? So who are you asking about how it went? Are you only paying attention to the voice in your head? And is that voice talking to you at 4:30 in the afternoon when you have been facilitating all day and you flew in and you're tired and now you're listening to that sort of whiny, hungry, weary voice that's telling you you were terrible that day? I don't know that I would want to believe it. So I would be making sure in a very disciplined way that you're checking with the people whose opinions matter. And yours does matter, but so too does your client or sponsor. So too do the participants. Maybe you work with a coach. Maybe you had a colleague in the room. And so I'd be getting multiple perspectives. I come out of a research background, and this is called triangulation. And I would like to triangulate your opinion about how it went. And I would encourage you not to gather that opinion or believe yourself too strongly at 4:30 in the afternoon at the end of a long day. Similarly, that reflective practitioner piece needs to be built into your practice as a habit. One of the things I'm learning to do, for example, is when I plan a session, I have my script, but when I go to save it later in my folders on my laptop, I'm trying to save version 2.0, which is what actually happened in the room. Because then I can learn from what I thought would happen and what did happen. So if I go to plan it again, I'm consulting back with version 1.0 and version 2.0. I'm not only doing it out of my head and out of memory, I'm doing it based on previous plans, which helps because I usually customize things out of my head. And so I'm developing a bit of a system, not only for going back to ones I've done before, but making sure I keep track of what actually happened and reflect later on what went back. So, and I can see Christiane saying the same thing. Write down what happened. How did you need to adjust? What did you need to add? And I've already done that here actually when we've been working on this together today. I have a couple scenarios that I wish I'd added to the slide deck. So, you know, if I ever have the chance to do this again, I will go back and add those in because I know already from your scenarios that you've given that I wish that I had had something visual prepared for you for that. So, Martin, I'd really like to pause there. I'm happy to talk more, but I'm hoping that gave us enough to start with some Q&A and to hear from other people's experiences.
Thank you very much indeed, Rebecca. Absolutely, I'm sure it did. That was great. I love your emphasis on the purpose. I think that's absolutely critical. And the notion of the Oblivious Facilitator as well, I really enjoyed. That's one of the things that stayed with me from reading the book. Also, the idea of holding your script lightly. I often say in facilitation training when people ask me, what do you do? How do you respond to disruptive behavior in a group when the participants are challenging your process, for example? Well, if you're finding that disruptive and if you're finding that difficult, maybe you're holding your script too tightly. You know, maybe that's what the problem is. You need to ask yourself that before assuming that the disruption is a problem or a bad thing. Equally, when people find the content of participants' contributions to be difficult or challenging, well, maybe that's because you have a stake or an interest in the outcome. You know, if you care too much about what they're talking about, maybe that could be an issue. So the reflective practitioner piece, I think, is absolutely crucial. Be really self-questioning about what it is about yourself that's contributing to this feeling of difficulty. What other questions do you all have? I see Therese writing, really excited to read the book and dig deeper. Absolutely, I'd encourage that. Sunny says, brilliant, so on target. One big challenge I find is the client, says Sarah. They expect you to stick to the script. Would be interested to get your reflections on this. My reflection is I don't show my script to my client. I show them a very, I show them a very high level, and I keep the detail to myself. What would you say, Rebecca?
That's the first problem: is don't show the client. I obsess with my clients about purpose. I really do. And I can't believe how many of them have no idea of the why of something. And I kind of half jokingly, but very seriously say, just because it's Wednesday or the first Monday of the month does not make for a reason to have a meeting. So I'm really keen on the purpose, the outcome, the deliverable. And I don't really get into the how with them. But I have to say that I'm learning over time that they need to have a lot of trust in me for that to be okay. And so because as I get into this more, I need less scripted stuff. I have to remember that they haven't walked that journey with me, and they probably need more of a script than I need. And so in service to them, I need to give them more of a script. It's not a script that I need, it's a script they need in order to have enough trust in me to let me do my thing. And so it's this balance of, look, you've hired me to be a process expert, please let me do my thing nicely. With also, I haven't earned enough trust yet to just say, hey, trust me, we'll be fine. So I need to find that balance of level of detail to give them. But if I can demonstrate we are achieving the purpose, I've never had a client be uptight about wishing we used a different activity to get there, as long as we get there. And the other thing is that I keep in very close touch with my client throughout the session. If it's a longer session and they're there, every break, every lunch, all that kind of stuff. But I would also say another tip for Nimble facilitation in terms of your own state. If you are an introvert, so I hear, you can guess that I'm not. But if you are not energized by being with people and your batteries net are depleted by that, and you take a 10-minute break in the morning and a 10-minute break in the afternoon, you need to go and hide during that break. Go lock yourself in a washroom cubicle someplace and recharge a little bit, because what will happen is your participants will want to talk to you. You will want to reset the room. You'll be grabbing a coffee and chatting, and all of a sudden the break is over and you are still even more tired than you were, and your thinking is still a little fuzzy. So there's some very practical tips of don't take the break you need if you need that break. And also just crazy things like don't be over caffeinated. It doesn't lead to clear thinking. You need a little bit of adrenaline, but not too much. A little bit of caffeine, not too much. So it's not only sleeping well the night before, but it's managing your own energy in the room that will allow you to be responsive.
Being well hydrated, I find, goes a very long way to being comfortable and alert in a room. You just have to be careful not to be too well hydrated that you have to go to those washrooms that Sunny loves so much. There's a couple of comments about the relationship of the process and the aims from Christoph and Sunny, which I think you've just been addressing really, Rebecca. But there's a specific one as well from Paul. What planning steps can you take to increase the likelihood that what you are told about participants and their expectations is reasonably accurate? And then we have a question from Susan. Her hand is raised. I'd encourage the rest of you, please, if you have a mic, do raise your hand. Rebecca, would you like to respond to Paul's question?
I am skeptical of the single informant. Again, you can hear my researcher thing coming in. How can I triangulate the perspectives of my one client informant? And so if I only have one point of contact with a group in advance, I try to have more. So I ask if I can, if it's a small-ish group, can I have contact with people ahead? Can I call them ahead? Is there someone else's perspective I can get? If I can't, for various reasons, I always set up my room early so that half an hour-ish before the session, as people are drifting in, I'm fully ready to go. I talk to them. So this week I was training in Saskatchewan, which is in the middle of Canada, and I literally talked to every single person in the room as they came in and said, what was it that brought you to this workshop? And so my examples became about that. And so I don't cling too tightly to what I was told in advance. I actually build it in the room. Now I know that that comes with a certain level of need to be confident because I flex with what they said, and my examples all changed based on what they told me they were coming to do because it was different than I've been told. So that does take a bit of practice. But if I had set up my room with 5 minutes to spare, or if I'd set it up early and then left to go answer my email, I wouldn't have benefited from those multiple perspectives. And so I would say that's why I love stakeholder engagement. Multiple perspectives are protective. And so I think you should seek them out. And I just want to go back to something that Christophe was asking about what makes something off script or off track. And I actually think, again, it's about purpose. But if I'm not sure if a particular detour is in fact purposeful or not, I will ask the group, and I will also put a time limit on it. So I'll say, we're going down something that could be perceived as a bit of a rabbit trail here. I can't tell if it is, and it's actually not even my job to know if it is because I'm not the content expert in the room. How would you feel if we took 10 more minutes on this one? Or do we need to change the purpose of this chunk to address this issue that wasn't expected? So I'm pretty committed to the purpose and to the little mini purposes, but I will also change them at the behest of the group. But I don't do that lightly. It's kind of like changing the vision or mission of an organization. You do it once every 15 years, but you don't do it every strategic planning cycle. So I don't lightly do it, but I would entertain the possibility.
Thank you. Carol mentioned she gives surveys sometimes ahead of time. I sometimes do that, or even one-on-one consultation calls with members of the group, particularly if it looks like the stakes might be high or the issues might be contentious. We've got hands raised from Susan and Susanna. So could we start with Susan, if you'd like to unmute yourself, please, Susan, and share your question.
I just wanted to reiterate what you just said, is if it's at all possible to talk to other people that are going to be in the room that have a stake in what's going to happen, because that's how I find out that for example, I work a lot with nonprofit organizations, that the executive director's idea of what they need to do is very different from what the board chair's idea of what they need to do is. And I need to be able to hear from both of them, and frequently will get on a conference call for the three of us to agree on what the purpose is and what the end product will be of that day, in order to make sure. But then, speaking of the end product, one of the things that I like to do is come in and say, here is what the purpose is, here's the product that we're going to end up with at the end, and ask the group, is there anything I've left out? Is there anything that isn't? And then we discuss on whether in this 4 hours or this 8 hours we can actually get to that, and then agree on where we're heading. The couple of times that I have forgotten to say we can't necessarily get to all of it, that's when we ended up with, at the end of the day, not getting to everything, and then some people being disappointed because we didn't get to everything. But if you can get the agreement and then remember to say, we may not get to all of it, that works better.
Yeah. Setting expectations is so important. And I think one of the questions I'm finding useful right now is I'll say to a client, either in the scoping meeting ahead of time or even in the room, what do you want to have in your hand at the end of the day? And what do you want to have experienced at the end of the day? Or sometimes a variation of that is, what do you want to know and what do you want to feel when this is done? Or what do you want to have? What do you want to have produced? And so kind of tapping into different senses in that question helps them to go, okay, it's content and experience, right? It's rational experiential. It's what do you want to know or have written, but also what do you want the experience of getting there to have been like? Because our purpose is multiple in that sense. And so sometimes when we talk about did the day go badly or well, you might have achieved part of a purpose, but not the whole thing. So maybe you've got the experiential objective nailed, but not the content objective. And ideally you want both, but if you can get one or the other, it's better than having zero. So I also would encourage you to cut yourself a bit of slack in terms of, it's not really slack, but it's saying there's lots of ways to get to a win. And I say that to groups. I say, or I use the example of a road trip or a travel in some way, we can agree on the destination, but the route to get there might look different than we think. And so that goes back to Christophe's question too about being off track. If we agree that we have to take an airplane for this part and a van for this other part and a train for this other part, we're still going to the same place. But some pieces of the journey are going to take us longer than others, and it's going to feel like a detour because it's under construction over here, but that's okay. We're still going to get there at the end. But you're setting expectations. One of the other metaphors I use for setting expectations is the idea of cleaning out a closet. When you're cleaning out a closet and you pull everything out and things get messy before they get better. And then that's when the phone rings and then dinner has to be made and kids have to be driven somewhere. And then you go back upstairs and you're like, oh, it's all out of my bed and I can't even go to sleep. And it would have been better to leave the mess inside. That's sometimes what the morning can feel like, or day one of a 2-day event or something. And I warn people that it's not going to feel tidy or nice and neat. And if you are the highly orchestrated person, that's going to frustrate you. And that's okay. If you don't mind trusting me, it'll have the nice neat bow on it later, or maybe it won't. It'll have it on it 3 months from now when the project is done. So it's setting some expectations so that the people that get stressed about mess are okay, because I'm not personally someone who's very stressed at mess. And so I forget sometimes to warn people that it's okay for things to be messy for a while.
That's what Sam Kaner would call the groan zone between the divergent thinking and the convergent thinking. The divergence of your cleaning out your closet and the convergence of putting it all back together again. Right.
The middle one very often.
Let me ask you, Rebecca, if you could. Let me ask you to take 2 questions very quickly before we move on and allow 10 minutes for discussion before we close. There's a question from Ezekiel: how do you evaluate whether the authority of a contact with the client is at the right hierarchical level? That's one. And Susanna has had her hand raised for a minute or two. Susanna, would you like to unmute yourself and quickly raise your question verbally?
Yeah, I just wanted to raise, I know earlier at the very beginning a few people mentioned rogue thinkers, and was just curious if there's any insights into handling rogue thinkers, including when, like, if you've had the group agree that that's not what we're thinking about and that the rogue thinker is still stuck on that. Well, that's my understanding of a rogue thinker. So it was just a question about dealing with that, if that's interesting to other people here.
Mm-hmm. I'm interested in the language because I catch myself sometimes when I'm holding too tightly to my script thinking somebody is a rogue thinker, which in my lexicon has kind of an exciting but a little bit negative connotation to it. And where the balance is between really off script, off track thinking and creative thinking. And so I check my own self and go, am I getting irritated by this because it's not what I expected, and trying to shut it down when it actually has some creative interest for us? That would be one question. But if, as you said, the group has agreed that we're not going there, one of the things I don't do, let me answer it in the negative, I'll just put it right out there, I'm not a fan of parking lots. I never use them. I can't stand them. But what I do is I will say, if there are issues that come up that I'm not actually willing on the group's behalf to talk about in that session, I will park it as an action item. So before it gets left on a parking lot kind of wall, I'll say what actually needs to happen and who needs to do it by when. So it becomes this little implementation planning moment of when is that conversation going to happen and who's going to take responsibility for it. And you have this very quick moment in the room where the outlier maybe realizes that no one else in the room wants to take responsibility or attend an ongoing conversation about that. And they go, oh, okay, yeah, there really isn't anything here. Or we at least agree, oh, that's your big thing. You go deal with that later, but we're not dealing with it here. Another way I do it, and I explain this better in the book than I'll be able to right now, is that I have a couple of visual tools to assess consensus in a room. So if you have someone that's like, well, everybody knows that everyone thinks blah, 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 I will test that out visually. So I'll have people put an X, like for a bunch of things. I won't single out that one opinion or one person, but I'll be like, as you're leaving for your break, can you put an X on the wall on these little continuum that I've just drawn on here, these spectrum exercises? If you are a yes or no on this, stick your X. And if you're a yes or no on this, can you put your X on there? And do you mind putting your opinion here? Okay, we got those 3 questions. Thanks for answering them on the flip chart as you head out to get your coffee. So then when they come back in the room, they notice that there's one outlier on that one thing and everyone else in the room thinks this. Or you say, there's a huge diversity of opinion on that issue. That's interesting. So the person who was very much about, well, everyone knows this, has a visual, anonymous tool by which to acknowledge perhaps that his or her opinion was not the dominant opinion, but I didn't have to say it. And I didn't have to bring them back. Or I will give people a chance to use their own words. Writing things on Post-its would be a classic example. That rogue opinion can go up on the wall with everybody else's. But as we start clustering those into themes, and there is no theme where that one fits, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that outlier, except if the outlier is the creative, quiet, interesting voice that the group goes, actually, there's something there. So I don't want to silence it, but I have some process things that I do to test it out, if I can put it that way.
Thank you. I'm going to move us on, if I may, because we have only 10 minutes left. I do encourage you, Rebecca, to continue to respond to questions you see in the chat, if there's anything you'd like to respond to. But at the same time, all of you, there are now 2 new chat pods center screen for you. We're keen to give you an opportunity to share something of your experience. You have already, but it would be great to capture something of your experience as well. What are some examples of how you have responded to the unexpected, and what have you learned from that experience? And also any insights or next steps for you to take away and act on as a result of this webinar, this session. So please feel free to contribute to either and both of those chat pods, and I'll ask Rebecca to comment on what she sees in those, and also any other questions you see in the general chat. Rebecca, there was one which I don't think you had a chance to respond to. Christoph says, I'm not a fan of parking lots. Please say more. What do you mean by that?
Did you see my answer I just typed?
Oh.
Just now.
Oh, did you?
It says, I think parking lots are where things go to die. That's why, frankly. I think that they don't honor people's interest in something, and they just get lost and don't get followed up on.
Yeah.
That's not to say that I think they're, I'll put it positively. There's lots of things that are worthy of discussion, but not right now. So that's why I treat that as a bit of an implementation planning or action planning place where I'll say, that's a topic. When and where are we going to follow up on that? So it's not
right. Yeah, I do the same. I actually like to call it a fridge rather than a parking lot, because it's a place to put ideas to keep them fresh until you do have an opportunity to address them. But then I make sure that we come back to the fridge and see what's chilling in the fridge at the end of the meeting and decide what to do with it and when and how are we going to deal with it later.
If you saw my fridge right now, you would know that metaphor would not work well for me. It's like that comedian that talks about, I don't know what you call them in Britain, but we call them the crisper, which is the drawer in the bottom of the fridge that vegetables go in. And he laughs about how nothing ever leaves the crisper more crispy than it went in. That's for sure.
You should come and see my fridge. I have a very tidy fridge at home. What do we see in the chat pods? Christiane had an unexpected elephant in the room once.
And I ask people, I say, look, I think this one is big, and I think it's going to take us a while, and are we okay? And if we are, or if it's really big, I will say, I honestly don't think we can achieve the purpose until we deal with this. Am I wrong about that? Like, I'll test that. I won't dive in, but I'm like, I think this is big, but maybe it isn't. Let me know. You know?
I'm reminded of a surprise in the room a few months ago with a client I worked with. They were anticipating it was a 3-day retreat of a wide variety of different stakeholders who all had a common cause together, needed to come up with a coherent plan. It was a big NGO, and they were concerned to get everybody online with a common strategy for a campaign. They were very keen for me to speak with lots of different stakeholders in advance, and so I did. But by the time we were getting towards the end of day 2, beginning of day 3, it began to become clear that actually the stakeholders I really needed to speak to, I hadn't yet spoken to, and their needs were not being met. And we had to really overturn the script and do something different on day 3 in order to get their needs met. And it that turned out to be an elephant in the room that just needed to be addressed right then. And, you know, they were very great. The whole group was, in fact, very grateful that I was ready and willing to just do something different and take what time was necessary to address it. But it became very clear to me that that was the only thing to do. It was the right thing to do.
You've invested 3 days already, too. Like, I should say, it's harder to be nimble when the execution is, like, when mistakes are really high and you've already invested a bunch of time. That's really hard. And you know, no disrespect intended, but I've been in sessions where somebody has said, well, I think everyone who's supposed to be here is here. And I think, maybe not. You know, maybe there's some key people we haven't heard from that we actually need to hear from. And maybe there's some voices we need to draw in other ways, you know? So, I appreciate, I really admire your willingness to go back on that, because that's a hard one when you're already day 3.
I very often ask at the beginning of a session in introductions, is there anybody who is not here whose perspective we need to remember? And that can be quite interesting, quite valuable. What else do you see, Rebecca, that you'd like to comment on in the experience or insights and next steps? Anything there?
I'm having, my thing is really small, so I'm just looking to see. No, I think I really appreciate people's willingness to share their experiences a lot. And I appreciate that you're taking things away from this that'll be useful. Martin, I don't know if we can have a quick look at the, I don't know, I wanted to make sure people knew how to stay in touch. And also the,
yes, absolutely.
For those that want to go deeper into this kind of thing, I do online facilitation skills training courses about twice a year. They're 4 weeks long. They're online, but in a conversational format, and then we do telephone coaching once a week. And the only reason I'm offering it right now, or mentioning it right now, is because one of them starts on the 29th of April. And it's called Making Your Good Stuff Better. And it's a little bit on nimbleness, but it's also on taking your tools to the next level of effectiveness or engagement. And so if that's useful to people, I just wanted to make sure you knew about that. And also that the book itself is available all around the world, I hope, on any Amazon affiliate, or you can contact me directly and I'll send you one.
Absolutely. I'm going to move us on to our final screen because we just have 3 minutes left till the top of the hour. So apologies if you were about to type into one of those chat pods. In our last few minutes, I would invite you to rate today's session and share with us how likely you are to recommend these webinars to others. And share contact details in the chat pod in the bottom center. If you wish, wait until after the recording is stopped in a couple of minutes before doing that. And at the bottom right, you'll see web links. So if you click on that link to Rebecca Sutherns Nimble Facilitation, you'll find a link, I think, to the web page rather than to the Amazon page. I can't remember now which link I put there. And you'll also find a link to further free facilitation webinars from me and also to Sunny's Virtual Facilitation Collaborative. If there are any other links you'd like to share, Rebecca, feel free to type the links into the contact details pod. And let me finally just add, I would encourage all of you to go to your local Amazon site and write a review of the book for Rebecca if you have read it, or just a review based on what you've seen and heard today, because that will help bring the book higher up the search results when people are searching for it and help make it more available to more people. I was telling
Martin, when you type in, if you type in Nimble, you're going to get Jack be nimble, Jack be quick if we're not careful. So type in Nimble Facilitation, type my name, and you'll find it more easily. Until it gets right on the first page, in which case you'll see it.
And you were right. Scrolling down, I did find it. Thank you. I will review.
Please do also share any other feedback on the session in the general chat pod. We've got just another minute or two. Susan has her hand raised. Please go ahead, Susan, just quickly.
Just wanted to comment that you said to share the contact information after the recording is stopped, but you're still recording. So.
Okay. Thank you. So those who typed in, that will be visible in the recording. But the contact, whatever contact details you share in there, I will email to all of you afterwards so that you can keep in touch with each other. And with that, we've taken an hour. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for sharing something of your experience of the book. I do recommend it if I haven't mentioned that already. Great read. Thank you for that. Thank you also, Sunny, for joining me again, and thank all of you for joining the webinar. I'm going to close the recording now. I wish you well for the rest of the day, but do stay on for a little if you'd like to chat for just a little bit longer.